The MixTape Challenge is part of This Week in Podcasting, a network that brings together music, television, entertainment, and pop culture programming all in one place. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/thisweekinpodcasting. You are tuned in once again to the MixTape Challenge, the music discovery game show podcast where contestants challenge each other to create a 4-track music mix based on a different theme every episode. Today's challenge comes to us from the MixTape Challenge vaults once again, and we are calling it Open It Up. Each contestant must create a 4-track music mix of track ones. Yep, that means each of the 4 tracks in our mixes has to be the first track on their respective albums. So I'm your host and contestant, Jeff Hulit, and we have 2 contestants here along with me for this challenge, as we always do. Let's go ahead and meet them now. First up, returning contestant and pop culture curator, Krista Garofalo. Welcome back to the show, Krista.
Thank you for having me again, Jeff.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. Krista is actually our first returning guest on the show.
Yay.
So
I'm very excited to be back.
All right, next up is time travel expert and music collector, Mr. Steve Sikoryak. How are you, Steve?
I am great. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me on. I'm a long-time listener, by the way. First-time caller.
Yes, nice. Steve has been a long-time podcast listener of all my shows. Thanks for that, Steve. So before we jump into the music discussion here, Steve, I don't know if you wanted to quickly mention the projects that you're working on right now. I know you have a very cool time travel project you're working on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. My project world is called Paradox Parkway. Right now it's a website, a future podcast collecting all things paradoxical, which heavily includes time travel and confusion and delusion. The site now has over 10,000 entries of books, TV shows, and movies related to time travel, plus at least 300 different paradoxes. And compiling that data and talking about it is one of my passions.
Awesome. Yes, we've had many great conversations in the office about these things. It's always fun. And people can find that at paradoxparkway.com, right?
Correct. Thanks.
Awesome. Krista, are you working on any projects right now?
Mostly just working on, new mixes and trying to come up with different, themes to kind of wrap around some of the new music that I've been discovering, mainly just kind of doing that and trying to share it with people. I'm also I've been curating some video playlists. I started doing this a little while ago. One of my colleagues at work was diagnosed with breast cancer. And when she was telling me that her chemo sessions were so long and nerve-wracking and kind of, she was trying to figure out what she should do to kind of distract herself from, the whole process of it. I started making her these video playlists of just different clips from award shows and musical performances, things I knew she would enjoy that would just kind of distract her from, what she was going through. And she kind of said it really helped her. So I've been kind of working on that and, through my YouTube channel and kind of just sharing those with her and thinking about, where I might be able to pass them on to other people to kind of help them through that process. So that's something I've been thinking about expanding to a wider audience.
Oh, very cool. We're going to have to get a link to your YouTube channel here up on the website so people can check out those videos.
No problem.
Awesome. So our first segment on the show before we jump into the actual challenge is a section called What's on Loop, where we all talk about what we've been listening to a lot lately. And Steve, what have you been listening to lately? I know you have your headphones on in the office a lot.
So always been a fan of popular music. Since popular music began, my collection spans 100 years of music. I like music from the 1920s all the way through today. And I find that I don't seek out new music, but I enjoy the music once it becomes popular, interestingly. So I'm usually listening backwards. Lately, I've been listening to the last couple of David Bowie albums to kind of catch up because I missed those as they came out, Black Star and The Next Day, and they're great. Currently, I'm listening to another passion of mine is soundtrack music for movies. I've been listening to the Shape of Water soundtrack from Alexander Desplat, and I had that before it became the Academy Award winner, proud to say. So I've been listening to that, and I also found an old release of the Popeye movie with Robin Williams with original demos from Harry Nilsson. So that's been in my playlist lately, but I imagine not in a lot of other people's.
Awesome. Is any of that in your current playlist, Krista?
No, that's quite an eclectic playlist. I like that. No, a lot of my stuff, I have a bunch of new things from some old favorites, and then a couple new artists that I've discovered. A couple of the ones I was familiar with that have some new albums out. Belle and Sebastian, How to Solve Our Human Problems, parts 1 through 3, just came out not that long ago. I've been enjoying that. And Casey Musgraves, who's a really great country singer, just came out with a new album called Golden Hour. Both of them kind of in like the mellow, laid back, kind of have a 70s vibe to them. So I've been enjoying those. And then a couple new artists, some new indie artists that I've discovered. One of them is Detroit Social Club. They're a British indie rock band. They have a 2-song single that just came out in, I think in January, called Goodbye. I'm really enjoying that. It's standard British indie, rock. And then another band called Model Rockets. They're an indie pop and rock band from Ohio, and they just put out their debut album called Daybreak. So it's been a lot of indie stuff and kind of mellow stuff too. Just I guess to ease through, the next couple of months until, summer gets to us.
Yeah, I've been in a pretty mellow mood myself. I think on the last mixtape episode a couple of weeks ago, I was in a mellow mood, and I still am. So I have I've been listening to a playlist. I have about 1,250 or so songs, all mellow stuff on my phone, and I've just been shuffling that for the last few weeks. It includes a lot of stuff like Gregory Alan Isakov, Al Stewart, Autumn Defense, some Beatles in there, Regina Spektor, a lot of instrumental stuff. It's a humongous list, so I couldn't really name every single one of them. This would be a super long podcast if I did, but the mellow mood just continues, and it's great that we have all this cool modern technology to have all this music with us at all times, so to fit all moods. So is everybody ready to jump into the mixtape challenge?
Ready.
Absolutely.
All right, so we are going to jump into our Open It Up mixtape challenge. I'm going to spin the old wheel here to see who gets to go first. And it looks like Krista, you are going to be up first. So give us the title of your mix and a little bit about it and why you put the songs in the order that you did.
Great. So when I was thinking about putting everything together for this go round, thinking about track ones and, just opening up albums, I thought about discovery. I thought about how the first track is really sort of, it's your introduction to the rest of the album. And sometimes with certain artists, it's your introductory to the artist. And so I wanted to pick tracks that were seminal to me in terms of my life with music discovery. It was tracks from albums that, led me to want to continue listening to the album, wanting to go out and buy maybe everything that the artist had done if it wasn't their first album, wanting to maybe explore more of that genre as well, keep that going and explore other artists in that. And also some things that kind of tied back to some personal discoveries of mine. So the title of my mix is Discoverer, and it's actually the opening track of REM's last album that came out in 2011, Collapse Into Now. So I wanted to tie it back there too. So
little nod to REM from the first episode that we did.
Yeah, I always go back to REM. It's but so it's all about, for me, my mix was discovery. I put the tracks in order of when I discovered them, and not necessarily when they came out, but when I discovered them. So, because not some of them, it was, when it did first come out. Some of them it took me a couple years. Some of them it took me a couple decades. So, but in the order that I discovered them, and some of the meanings that were going on in my life around that time frame as well. So,
very cool. So you want to jump into your first track?
Absolutely. So my first track came out in 1991, and I discovered it pretty soon after, it came out as a single. It is Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, off of the 1991 album Nevermind. This was the first track that came to my mind when I started thinking about what I was going to do for this one. It was the first one that kind of, when I was thinking about it, I was like, oh, I have to put this on here. It's a great opening track, and it has so much different personal and beyond just me significance in the music industry at large. It was sort of, to me, and I think to a lot of people my age, it was sort of, how we discovered grunge rock and alt rock, when it was what became the mainstream, what broke into the mainstream, for this new music that was coming out that a lot of us were discovering around that time. If we weren't in Seattle, people in Seattle knew about it a lot longer before that. But it also came out when I was 13 years old, and, the idea of this new type of music that was sort of unapologetic and brash and sort of a teen revolutionary theme kind of appealed to me. Coming from the late 80s into the early 90s, at around that age, it was a lot of dance music and a lot of poppy stuff, and it was out there, and I was, everyone in 7th grade was listening to this, so of course you're going to just kind of go along with it because of, that age. But this was something that kind of spoke to me in a way that other music, prior to those years had never really done. The angst of it, and trying to be representative, I think, of, what was going on with people my age and struggling to go into my teenage years. I know that Kurt Cobain had talked about how, he felt like it was his duty to describe what he felt about his surroundings and exploring, his generation and people my age. So it was kind of a call to arms, I think, for a lot of people our age, talking about, how we felt and sort of the anxiety, I think, about how we felt. And just sort of the perception that people had of young people, which is not necessarily a new thing. I mean, that's a pretty common thing in music, but also just sort of kind of pushing back on some of those little stereotypes, when he says, here we are now, entertain us, kind of alluding to the whole kids just need to be entertained, and you just, you can't, they have no attention span, and they're easily distracted, and kind of mocking that and kind of in a way that says, we're more than that. You should treat us as being more than that. And so it really was, coming out when I was 13, it was such an impressionable age for me. It was like I had stumbled upon something that was just meant for me. And that was when I really started embracing alternative rock and finding Stone Temple Pilots, finding Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, all that stuff was exploding at that point. And I'd kind of gotten to the point where, the music that I was listening to was really like more representative of the person that I was becoming, as opposed to just sort of being kind of background music in my mind. So to me, this was, with the sweeping guitar intro, just sort of kind of coming in there and saying like, hey, listen to us, this is different. I just really responded to it, really kind of felt like I had found a place to kind of go and explore more with what was out there at the time.
Yeah, I remember when this came out and how the paradigm shift in the music industry after Nirvana came out. And it actually, I think grunge actually polished off one of the more poppier trends in the 80s that I was actually kind of into at the time. I remember a lot of my friends were getting into all this new, grunge alternative rock music. And I was kind of getting lost in the shuffle at that time. Steve, do you have any recollections of Nirvana coming onto the scene?
What I was going to say was a great pick, a seminal album, and the whole Kurt Cobain experience is good classic rock icon with a tragic ending. In hindsight, I think in a weird positive way, that's what kind of lingers on with that. I mean, he made a great influence, like you said, Krista, spoke to the generation at the time, and you kind of miss that sometimes. There's a lot of blur today, and that seemed very specific. So I like that.
So, Krista, you want to move on to your track number 2?
Sure. So track number 2 is an artist that I discovered after discovering REM. It was one of those down the rabbit hole things when I was reading everything about them and being like, oh, who are their influences? And I should definitely be listening to all of them. And one that came up over and over and over again was Patti Smith. Was like, okay, I got to go out and get this album that Michael Stipe keeps talking about, how he was 15 years old and, he was sitting there with his headphones on, listening to it, eating a bowl of cherries, and how it changed his life. I was like, obviously it's going to change my life too. So my second pick is the opening track to the 1975 album Horses, called Gloria. It's kind of like a somewhat cover because there is, it was based on a poem called Oath that she wrote in the early 70s, but kind of mixed with influences of the track Gloria by them. She's rewritten some parts, but there's definitely some allusions to and some direct taking from that song. But it's a stunning opener. It opens very delicately with, a little piano intro, and then she just sort of I think just puts out there, her manifesto to the world, not necessarily literally, but like based on this, you can kind of see like, okay, this is someone to be reckoned with. The first line of the song is, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. Now that was shocking to people. It was taken literally, which it shouldn't have been. But I mean, it just sort of announced right at the bat, like, this is going to be something different. This is going to be someone that's not afraid to put out there who she is, what she wants, how she wants people to see her. And Patti Smith is someone that is pretty much been lauded as sort of the grandmother of punk. She was experimenting in proto-punk. She was at CBGB's and Max's Kansas City in the 70s, doing poetry and then moving into music and kind of becoming a lyricist. And she was when they closed down CBGB, she was the last person that performed there. And she started out in poetry, and it kind of evolved from there. A lot of her music involves like interludes with spoken word in the middle of the songs, but this was a statement of independence. It was not wanting to be sort of fettered with any particular religious institution, but also not a statement specifically against Jesus, but kind of wanting to own up to her own mistakes or successes and not kind of placing them in the hands of something else for her at the time. It starts slow. It's a solemn song in the beginning, and then it sort of builds to the chorus. And it was something I'd never heard before. I had never listened to punk before. I had not listened to, probably at that point, any serious female artists. And I was just sort of trying to get into that at that point. And it was sort of a breath of fresh air, the honesty of it, the brashness of it. The cover of the album, it's her in, sort of like a men's style shirt and pants with suspenders. She wasn't being packaged in the way I had remembered a lot of female artists at that time. There wasn't a lot of, female sexuality being sort of put out there. It was about the artist. It was about her output. It wasn't about her image, and it wasn't about her, what she looked like and how that would appeal to different audiences. So I really responded to that. And really, the whole album is great. The kickoff track is just, it's wonderful in terms of putting out there, this is what I am. And I don't care if you like me. I want you to like my music, but I don't care if you like me because this is who I am, kind of thing.
Nice. Well, another excellent pick. Steve, thoughts on Patti Smith?
I have not listened to enough of Patti Smith. Certainly Horses I listened to some time back, but another great pick, a true artist. I like where you were going there at the end, Krista. It's about the music, man. not about not about everything else. So it's great.
Krista, moving on to track number 3.
So my track number 3 kind of brings me to my freshman year of college, and which is, an interesting and exploratory and discovery time for most people. This album did not come out. It came out prior to me going to college, but I did not discover it until a couple of friends that I'd met freshman year, had this album in their collection, and it kind of came to me from them. And also my roommate had a copy of it, and it's the first track, Crucify by Tori Amos, off of the 1992 album Little Earthquakes. Big confessional, piano-driven tracks on this album. It was her kind of debut. She did have a kind of pop synth band that she had attempted to kind of, put some albums out with, called Why Can't Tori Read? It was very, very different than a lot of her piano confessional work that she became known for. It was about, the song and the album exploring the complexities of finding your own voice. And it was also one of the albums that sort of set the stage for the explosion of women songwriters in the 90s. That was the time that, building up from that, was Lilith Fair was becoming a thing, with Sarah McLachlan. And female artists, singer-songwriters in particular, were getting record deals. They're being signed to labels. They're getting, mainstream access more than they had in the past. We had, like I said, Sarah McLachlan, Paula Cole, Jill Solbuel, so many wonderful female artists kind of getting the stage and being mainstream more than they've ever been. This song, it's a very dark, ominous song, metaphor about, how we critically judge ourselves because we think we aren't really good enough. She says, why do we crucify ourselves every day? Crucify ourselves. Nothing I do is good enough for you. So she's sort of alluding to, I think, the self-doubt that a lot of us have in our lives. And in particular, I was responding to that at that time. I had just started college, and, you're moving away and you're having this new experience, and you're kind of forced to make friends again, and you're like, I haven't had to do this a lot of time, for a lot of people since I was 5, and are people going to like me, or are people going to respond to me, and am I good enough for all of this? And so responded very much to that personally. That was sort of the time that I was really discovering those things and learning those things and what I believed about, certainly politically as well. So that was sort of why I picked this song. It was very personal for me, and, just sort of represented this time in my life where I was really learning more about female artists and really exposing myself to more female artists, as much as, everyone around me was kind of moving that direction as well.
Yeah, I've known a lot of Tori fans in my lifetime. She was quite groundbreaking when she came out. I remember a lot of the people that actually, one of my best friends was a huge Tori fan years and years ago, and he kind of played a lot of her stuff for me. I wasn't following music that closely at the time, so my first exposure to her was through him. Steve, do you have any thoughts on Tori Amos?
Only to say I like this pick with the other two, keeping your discovery theme and these, visionary singer-songwriters, delivering the goods. Another great addition.
Thanks.
Nice. All right. So, Krista, want to wrap it up with your track 4?
Sure. My last track, I was really excited by the way that the way this kind of came together, that I had a good amount of female artists on this list, because I'm just always excited to sort of put those out there for more people to discover. And, so the last track that I have is also big female artists. It was the first track off of the 2006 album Taking the Long Way, and it is The Long Way Around by the Dixie Chicks. I had never really listened to country music. I was a Johnny Cash fan because, it's Johnny Cash. But I had never really explored country music, never really thought that was something I was that interested in from the things I had kind of heard. And, this album came out in 2006, and I didn't really discover it until a year later, after they had won all the Grammy Awards. But this was their album that they came out with. It was the album that came out after the 2003 comments that they had made about the then president, that had gotten them into a world of trouble with country music as an establishment and country music fans. Up to that point, they were country music darlings. Everyone loved them. They were selling out albums. They were selling out arenas. They could do absolutely no wrong. And, basically from, the things that they had said, they were pretty much abandoned by country radio, by, the establishment. Their fans were burning their CDs. And, there was a lot of impact to their career and their personal lives. I believe Natalie Maines got a good amount of death threats after that. And so this album was really a response to that, and a response not just about what it had done to their career, but how it had personally affected their lives and how they had kind of coped with it. And they kind of went outside of the box. Rick Rubin was the producer on this album. They worked with Dan Wilson from Semisonic as a co-writer on a lot of these songs. And this opening track is really a manifesto to nonconformity. It's talking about taking the long way, not doing what everybody else, in their lives and, who they grew up with and the path that they had normally taken. That was the standard path for people in their situation, that, they had kind of gone down a different road, that they weren't going to follow everybody else just because that was the thing that you did at the time. There's definitely allusions to what they went through during that time frame. It says in here, I fought with a stranger and I met myself. I opened my mouth and I heard myself. It can get pretty lonely when you show yourself. Guess I could have made it easier on myself. So talking about, the whole incident, and, if they had just sort of quickly apologized, I'm sure it wouldn't have become a thing that it did. But they were like, we're not apologizing. We believe in what we said, and we're not going to back down just because people don't really like hearing what we have to say about it. So I kind of responded to this in a very excited way, because it was country music that I really liked, and I really didn't like. I think I liked country music. Also, I discovered it about a month before I moved to Florida, and it was a time when I was sort of transitioning and moving away from my life in New Jersey, and kind of taking the long way and kind of deciding to go down a different path than I really thought I was going to in my life. So it was literally, this was the song that I pulled out of my apartment complex too when I was getting on the road to drive down to Florida to move. So I have some personal associations with it. And, I was leaving pretty much everything I knew. I'd lived in New Jersey my entire life, except for 2 years when I was in grad school in Georgia. All of my friends were there. At the time it was the right thing for me. But, at the same time, I was like, what am I doing? Like, where am I going? I don't know anything. I don't know anybody in Florida except for family. And, I'm losing all of these people, not completely, but, that's how it felt at the time. So this album kind of, brought a lot of that up for me, and kind of really reflected kind of the mood that I was in and what I was about to undertake as well. So, it was really right place, right time for me with this. And it also kind of spurred me to be like, maybe there's other country music I really like out there, and I just haven't really given it a chance. So started exploring their catalog as well. Their album previous to this one, Home, was a bluegrass album, which I was like, oh, I don't know. I love that album. So I went back to their back catalog, and I also started exploring, other country artists, and discovering some of the other, female country artists I really liked, like Casey Musgraves, and who I still listen to today, and some other collaborations like Pistol Annie's and that kind of thing. So it kind of brought me to a place, like I said, with country music that I've just never been before. And I really, really enjoyed being pleasantly surprised by that, and kind of discovering a new genre for myself.
Yeah, and you got a very powerful memory from your life attached to the song, which is great. It's always nice to have a personal connection to a song that opens you up to a whole new genre. I must confess that I'm not very well versed with country. I'm familiar with the Dixie Chicks pretty much because of the controversy that you
Yeah,
mentioned
most people
earlier.
are.
And that was really, I remember living through that, and that was all over the news, and people were up in arms about it. But, that's kind of the power of music and celebrity in a way, that you can
Yeah.
have that type of an impact by making a controversial statement like that. Steve, do you listen to the Dixie Chicks? Do you have any familiarity with this stuff?
I do like them. I think I have an album, but I know they covered Landslide, and I always liked that song.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, Krista, what I really like is you said driving down to Florida, a life-changing experience. And what music do you choose to listen to in that enclosed environment with the great acoustics that you can sing along to that only solidifies your feelings? That's what I was thinking about when you said that. So that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It was very powerful. I was with my sister. She flew up, so I didn't have to drive down by myself. And we had both kind of become obsessed with that album prior to that. So it just made sense. It just made the most sense.
Well, great picks, Krista. Great mix. And we're going to run down Krista's mix once again for all you guys. At the end of the show, we're all going to repeat our mixes. So, Steve, are you ready to take us through your mix? Give us the title and a little bit about the mix that you made and maybe why you put the songs in the order that you did.
All right, here we go. Thanks again for asking, because this is fun. As you know, I'm a mixtape person since forever. So
master list maker too.
So my first thought went to the Beatles, and I said, I'll just pick any 4 albums and pick the first track, and I'm done. So I said, nah. And then I said, how about movie scores? That would be an interesting mix, because usually you got the theme, and then you'd be hearing Jaws or something. And I said, that'll be a great mix. Nah. So as I went deeper and deeper into this, I found myself visiting some of my old favorite artists. And then I found the natural synergy that seems to happen. My first and last name begin with S. And I suddenly found that I had a couple of tracks that also started with S. And then it just took a life of its own. So my original title for the mix was going to be 4 or 5 S's, but I thought that would just sound like a tire deflating. So that wasn't good. And then self-serving came to mind with a double S. No. And then I realized the songs I was picking all came out within 2 years of each other.
Oh, wow.
And it tells an interesting tale. So my title is called Something About the 60s.
Nice.
And let us begin.
Yeah, what's your track 1?
So track 1 is The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. Fascinating backstory. So the song was originally, this was released in 1966, but originally released on their prior album. And the album was a commercial flop. Sold like 3,000 copies. Paul Simon moved to Europe. Art Garfunkel went to college in Columbia. End of Simon and Garfunkel. Then, so this is a folk song, and the folk rock subgenre was just beginning. And their producer, Tom Wilson, took their track, Sound of Silence, and added electric guitars, bass, and drums, and re-released it. And suddenly it was a hit. Paul Simon had no idea about this. He was in England, and he sees his song listed on the Billboard charts and gets a call from Columbia Records and says, come back here, you've got a hit, you've got to put out another album. So they get back together. They create their second album, Sounds of Silence. This is the first track on that album, and it explodes. It won numerous awards, constantly being reused. Great opening lyrics. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. And apparently, Paul Simon likes to write music in near darkness. I've read. So
wow.
All coming together. So this song was #1 track, also on the Graduate soundtrack. A couple of their stats for you. At one point, it was the 18th most performed song of the 20th century, which I find fascinating. Ranked number 157 on Rolling Stone's greatest 500 songs of all time. And it goes on and on. So it's very representative of the 60s, of the folk to rock transition. And if that guy didn't overdub this song, there's no Simon and Garfunkel.
Wow.
So
That's a hell of a thought. I didn't know that story. I'm very familiar with Simon and Garfunkel, and I'm a big fan. I had no idea. I didn't read enough into them to that, but thanks for telling that story. It was very cool. Krista, you're familiar with this, I assume.
Yeah, I love Simon and Garfunkel. They have so many wonderful, beautiful songs, both in the music and the lyrics. They're lyrically significant, I think. And this is just a beautiful song. I had no idea about that backstory either. I had no idea that we possibly could have missed out on this. So that's very interesting. It's a great first pick.
Yeah. Excellent pick, Steve. So want to move us on to your track number 2?
Track 2, following the S theme. The reason I call this something about the 60s is because back then it's AM radio, no iPods. I don't even think cassettes were starting yet. And everybody listened to the same music. So all of the popular music, no matter what genre, kind of filtered through the same, radio stations. So you got to hear everything. That's why my next pick is Frank Sinatra, Strangers in the Night, from the album Strangers in the Night. So this was released just 5 months after Sound of Silence, playing on your radio station at the same time. So you got Frank Sinatra, crazy big in the 1940s, Sinatra Mania, a little slump later, big comeback in the 50s. He was acting, he was putting out songs for swinging lovers and things like that. And he just had hit after hit after hit. In the 60s, he, getting older, getting up there, and he puts out his own label, Reprise Records. And this album comes up in 66, and this song. He hated this song. He did not want to record it. He did it in one take. And if you remember the doobie doobie doo, if you know the song, at the end, he just did that as a goof. He said, I'm done. He just kind of like, I'm out of here. You want this song? Great. And of course, it went to number 1 on a number of charts. It won him a Grammy Award for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance that year. And the record won Record of the Year as well. So I like these stories about things that happened because they must happen. So this album went platinum with this song as the opener. It was the last album with his longtime arranger, Nelson Riddle, if you know that name. Big arranger. He really bumped up the Batman theme in the 60s. And so I picked this, once I had the S track, I picked this as a great representative, another thing in the 60s that you heard, whether you liked it or not, mixed in with Simon and Garfunkel and everybody else. So
yeah, this song brings back 2 memories for me, and it's weird how the brain works sometimes, but obviously it brings back memories of my grandparents because they were big Sinatra fans, and my grandfather especially would always sing Frank Sinatra songs. But the other memory that for some reason this song springs to my mind, and this is, I think you'll laugh at this, Steve, because I know we've talked about Night Court before, but there was an episode where Dan Fielding was having an illicit rendezvous, and he changed the words to this song to Strangers in the Night exchanging clothing, and I don't know why that stuck to my head, but it just came flooding back to me right now.
The song lingers on. He had to perform this song in his concerts. And you can imagine he hates this, and everybody wanted to hear it.
That's great. So I've heard other bands and artists have a similar feeling about some of their big hits, and they get sick of performing them, and they don't want to do it, but they kind of have to, because that's what the audience wants. Krista, thoughts on Strangers in the Night?
Well, growing up in New Jersey and being Italian, I am very familiar with Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra brings me back to every single Sunday dinner in Brooklyn with my dad's side of the family when we would go there. And even to this day now, we do weekly dinners every week. And there's a good chance I've been listening to this song every week for the past 10 years that I've lived here and just not really remembered it. But I find it fascinating and not really looking at the time frame of it and thinking of it in context with Sound of Silence, and just that those things were kind of happening around the same time. It doesn't make sense in my mind. I know it happened, but I find that so interesting. And I love what you talked about in terms of, back in the day, like you didn't have a choice. This is what was out there and this is what was on there, and everything was sort of commingled. And, we have so much variety now and a way to sort of segment ourselves away from certain things, because we're like, oh, I could just listen to this, or I can just just take this, or I can go, to Apple Music and just say that I want to hear these things. And it's kind of interesting. You kind of miss out on things that way. So there's something to be said about that sort of simple time back then where you just kind of had to be exposed to everything. And, whether you liked it or you didn't, like you said. And it's funny that you mentioned Night Court, because in my mind, I was going back to the time that Frank Sinatra, I always remember this guest starred. It was like a big thing on Who's the Boss, like towards like the end of, of his career and in the 80s, and just remembering like how like that was such a big deal to get him on that show. But yeah, I'm a big fan of this song, big fan of Frank Sinatra. I grew up listening to it. My parents are big fans, so that's a great pick.
One quick thing about, the mix of music, you made me think of, you may not have thought you made me think of it, but Cameron Crowe in his movies, he's a big fan, just like Quentin Tarantino. Great mix of songs,
yes,
across
definitely.
genres. And so they get it. So they, effectively choose a great mix of songs, even though you're not going to hear it on your own. So track 3. Meanwhile, in the 60s, this little duo named Sam and Dave put out an album called Soul Men with their opening track, Soul Man. A bit different than Sound of Silence and Strangers in the Night. So this was a song, came out in mid-67, co-written by Isaac Hayes as a response to riots in Detroit. And this is kind of a cool story. He saw photos of buildings that had the word soul written on them. And those were buildings where the rioters did not attack because they were African American owned and operated. So that was their way of protesting, but also supporting the cause. And this concept of soul struck Isaac Hayes, and it turned into this song. Kind of a pride of having the struggle, but maintaining our pride. So a really cool concept. So this song was, opening to a great R&B album. Instrumentation on the album by Booker T and the MGs, who were certainly, greatly represented through the 60s. This song went to number 2, covered many times over the years. At about a minute 15 into the song, you hear someone say, "Play it, Steve," which was going to be the name of this mix, talking to Steve Cropper from Booker T and the MGs. But anyways, went on. Certainly, you also recall the Blues Brothers covered it, and that actually went to number 14 as well. So a great song with great longevity.
Excellent pick. Krista, any thoughts on Steve's track number 3?
Yeah, I love this song. I'm familiar with Sam and Dave. Growing up in a household where my parents listened to a lot of, I guess, what you would call at the time oldies. I don't know what they call it now, but a lot of the stuff like that. I was exposed to a lot of stuff like this, and it's a fun song. And I had no idea, of the writing, the background with Booker T and the MGs and with Isaac Hayes and stuff, and that makes it there to be a little bit more depth in there that I didn't realize, especially with the larger implication of the title Soul Man and kind of what you talked about in that sort of back history. I find that very, very interesting because I guess 1967, I mean, that was the time when things were sort of kind of building to a head with a lot of that stuff with race relations, and I guess I never really associated with Sam and Dave with that, but I don't know a lot about their background. So it kind of makes me want to go back and listen to some of that stuff and read a little bit more about the history of that and sort of maybe the subconscious politics going on with music in that genre at the time.
It's all about the message.
Yeah, very interesting backstory. Yeah. I didn't know about any of that stuff either. So thanks for sharing all these interesting notes, Steve.
Oh, no problem. So to wrap up my set, and keeping with the artist, album, and track all starting with the letter S, and needing to represent some rock in here, some hard rock, I went with Steppenwolf from their album Steppenwolf and their opening track, Sookie Sookie. And so it really completes the package of, we got some folk, we got some traditional pop vocals, we got some soul, and we got some hard rock, psychedelic rock mixed in the mix here. So here's a song, interestingly co-written by Steve Cropper from Booker T, so there's a little connection there. So this is the opening track on their debut LP. It's a great hard rocker, great intro. It introduced the organ sound. That was a big part of the Steppenwolf sound. And I love thinking about an organ as part of a rock band. Doesn't sound right, but it's there, of course. And great guitar licks as well, and vocals. It's just it's a nice representative song for the band and for the era. The album also had Born to Be Wild on it, and I think Magic Carpet Ride might have been on there as well. Or maybe that was the next one. But in any event, to be honest, it wasn't my first pick, but it nicely completed the package. And it's a good song covered by Iggy Pop and others. It's another representative of the 2-year span. This song came out in January 1968. So all of my tracks came out between January 66 and January 68. And I just love the diversity of it.
Wow. I thought they were more of a 70s rock band, but that's amazing. They must have been a little bit ahead of their time coming out in the late 60s with a sound like that.
Look at, we're big Beatles fans. Look at the transition of the Beatles from 64 to 5 to 6 to 7.
Mm-hmm.
Just the sound of each of their albums changed so much. And I think everybody was experimenting. And so by 1967, it was go for it.
Yeah. Anything goes. Krista, thoughts on Steppenwolf?
I'm not familiar with this particular track, more so with Born to Be Wild and Magic Carpet Ride. Particular Born to Be Wild only because I went through a phase where I was kind of obsessed with the Easy Rider soundtrack. So, but I know that Steppenwolf is sort of one of those seminal bands, and like you had talked about before, it's just so interesting with your mix of all of these things kind of happening in such a short time frame from each other, that there's so much, like you said, variety. And I have also always thought of Steppenwolf more as a 70s rock band as well. Just having all of these different things going on kind of in a very short span of time. And like you said, with the Beatles, it's the fact that their career and the progression from where they started to where they went was, such a short, it was like a decade, really. To me, that's amazing. And it shows just what you can kind of go from in such a short period of time. So it's just such an interesting mix for it all. It's all going on at the same time, but it's not anything like the last thing. So it's a great mix. I love it.
I love to think of parents and kids turning up and turning down the radio with each song. Frank Sinatra, turn that off, Dad. And then Steppenwolf comes on, turn that off, kids.
It is a very diverse mix, Steve. I have to say, it's fascinating to think that all that stuff, just like Krista and you said, that it all came around the same time. And listening to the sounds of each of those tracks, it's hard to think of them all being released around the same time. So fascinating that time period in music was so transformative, I think, and started a lot of trends that are still existing today. So excellent mix, Steve. All right. Well, I guess what'd you say? I was going to say, how about you, Jeff? Oh, well, I guess that just leaves me and my mix. So my mix is called The Lead In, and I think the title of the mix pretty much says it all. For me, the hallmark of a great track one is a song that leads you into an experience. This kind of goes back to talking about listening to albums as a whole and listening to them the way that artists intended them to be listened to. And all the songs in my mix have an instrumental lead in that builds up to some sort of a crescendo before the vocals come in. So I also made an effort to pick bands that I haven't picked for my previous mixes, as well as putting different genres in there, so to kind of mix it up a little bit. I think all of them are also really good examples of the work that the bands that created them did, and each is kind of iconic in its own way. Some are genre-defining songs, I think, that just really kick off some fantastic albums. And the order that I chose them in is pretty random. They're all track ones, of course, so and with the musical lead-ins for all, they don't really necessarily flow together in any tangible way. So I kind of started out with the mellowest of the four and just went from there. So the mood kind of builds up a little bit through this. All right, so my track number one is from 1989. It is the first track on The Cure's album Disintegration. It's called Plain Song. So The Cure is an English rock band that formed around 76. They've had a fluctuating lineup, but stayed pretty consistent. So Disintegration is their 8th studio record, and of course Plainsong is the opening track to what I think is a pretty seminal album. It starts off really quietly with some wind chimes ringing kind of in a haunting way before this crashing drum and synth intro starts about 20 seconds in. So it's kind of equal parts triumphant and melancholy. I think the synths kind of just resonate and swash around, and a lead guitar comes in, and everything just melds together into this atmospheric, moving song. And Robert Smith, the vocalist, his voice in this song is just amazing. It reverberates, and it's very haunting. And the vocals don't actually start until about 2 minutes and 39 seconds in. Although the song itself is very short lyrically, I think it's a very impactful song, especially for me. It's Robert listening to someone talking about feeling old and worn down, and at the end he expresses how that person's feelings have made him feel. So it's kind of a one-on-one conversation about, the pressures of life and happiness and, loneliness and things like that. And it serves as a perfect opening track to lead into the rest of the record, which shifts back and forth between melancholy and some more upbeat, harder songs, but definitely amongst some of my favorite albums. And there's live versions of most of the songs from this album, if not all of them. If you have there's a video out there where they do the entire album as a set at a show, and they're just absolutely incredible. I've been to a few Cure shows in my day, and their Blood Flowers tour in 2000 really made me appreciate how great this band is on stage. It's a huge treat. I almost wanted to pick the live version of this one because it's some of the most memorable concert experiences that I've had in my life. And Krista, I'm pretty sure we've discussed the Cure in the past, haven't we?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's come up a lot. I mean, because I know we've had a lot of discussions about music in the 80s and versus music in the 90s, and I know that we've talked a lot about the Cure. I do really like the Cure. I'm not as familiar with them as I probably should be. I'm more familiar with that album with Love Song and Pictures of You. So I'm definitely interested in going back and sort of listening to the lead track again to remind myself of it. But they're a great band. They're great. If you're looking for melancholy
mm-hmm.
and, just sort of something to sort of, maybe wallow in your misery for a little while. They're always a good go-to.
Oh yeah. Always good for gazing at the shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. Great pick.
Thanks, Steve. Any thoughts on the Cure?
Just to add that Friday I'm in Love is a standard in my Days of the Week playlist. But
nice.
But I really like your whole theme with the instrumental openings. I'm very intrigued by that, and I'm looking forward to that. But Cure is a great pick.
Yeah. Oh,
nonetheless.
And mentioning Friday I'm in Love is from one thing about the Cure that's really interesting. If you listen to their catalog, is the style of their music kind of changes from album to album. So some of them are the more melancholy, and some of them are more these upbeat, cheery pop songs like Friday I'm in Love. In fact, I think that almost the entire album, that's off the Wish album, I believe. I think that almost that entire album is these kind of upbeat, happier songs, whereas Disintegration is more of a downbeat and introspective type of record. So I like bands that can vary it up like that. All right, so moving on to my track number 2. This is from the year 2000. It is a live performance from a live album called House of Yes, live from the House of Blues. And the track 1 on that album is a song called Yours Is No Disgrace. So Yes is, for anybody who's not familiar with Yes, is an English progressive rock band formed in the late 60s. And their lineup has also fluctuated, much like the Cure's has fluctuated over the years. But as of this live recording, it was a pretty good mix of found some of the founding members and original members. So you've got John Anderson on vocals, Chris Squire bass, Steve Howe's an amazing guitar player, Alan White on drums, and a guy named Igor Koroshev on keyboards. So no Rick Wakeman, unfortunately, on this tour. But the studio version, it's a funny side note, the studio version of this song was the opening track on their 71 album, the Yes album. So for me, this is one of, or if not one of the best live openers for a Yes show. Anyone who's familiar with progressive rock can probably attest to what an incredible example of the genre, the progressive rock genre that this track is. For this live version, there's a little synth and drum bit added before the song actually starts. It's one of those, here comes the band, coming up on stage and the show's about to start. So they have a little thing at the beginning to hype the audience up. So you get a little extra bonus instrumental lead in here to get the crowd hyped. So everyone in the band gets to shine on this track as well. Steve Howe's lead guitar is just absolutely mind-blowing to me. I'm in awe every time I listen to it. So about 2 minutes and 10 seconds in to this track, John and the backing vocals start to come in. So you got quite a long instrumental lead in on this one. But as with a lot of other prog rock songs, this one goes through several different movements during its 13 plus minute runtime. And it would probably take half the podcast to go in through and analyze it all. But suffice to say, it's a masterpiece in my mind and a phenomenal way to start a live show. I was at one of the shows on this tour and I witnessed this song as the opener. And I think it was like 18 years ago or so. It just was overwhelming at the time. The audience was on their feet. Everyone was screaming and cheering. And everyone in this band, in my mind, is a true master of their craft. The skill it takes to pull off an epic like this live is just beyond me. I have an endless amount of respect for their talent. And whether prog is your thing or not, I don't think you can help but admire the artistry, especially being played live. And it's true art to me in every sense of the word. I mean, Steve, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Yes.
I'm a big fan of, especially of the early albums, Fragile and Close to the Edge. So I don't know this live version, so I'm kind of intrigued about that. But I've always been a fan of those. Probably their first 4 or 5 albums were in regular airplay. And connecting it to my playlist today, we didn't get prog rock yet in 1968. So this is coming a couple of years later. So this is great.
Yeah. Krista, have you ever heard listened to any Yes?
I'm familiar with probably a lot of the popular stuff that most people know, Roundabout and Owner of a Lonely Heart. I've never really delved too much into Yes, or even really a lot of prog rock, oddly enough. But I'm definitely interested in kind of exploring it and kind of seeing a little bit more about not just this track, but maybe some other albums as well, based on your wonderful description of what it is.
Oh, thank you. I've been a big progressive rock fan for almost all of my life. So Yes is just a natural fit in that for me. So I felt like it was a really good track to include here, as it's just once you actually go and listen to this track, I think you'll get a better picture of why this is such a good opening number for a concert. It just you can't get any more hyped than listening to this at the beginning of the show. So, all right, moving on to track number 3. This is one that I thought Krista and I might have duplicated on, but fortunately we did not. So this is from 2003 from Death Cab for Cutie's album Transatlanticism. The track is called The New Year. So Death Cab formed in 97 up in Washington, and the lineup has remained essentially the same until just recently when guitarist Chris Walla left the band. But Ben Gibbard is still there, Nick Harmer, Jason McGurr, Dave Depper, and a new guy called Zach Ray. So this album came out in 2003. It was their 4th studio record, and it was incredibly well received at the time, certified gold, selling 500,000 copies in the U.S. while being on an indie label, which is pretty incredible to think about. The word of mouth on this one was incredible, and it led to the band being signed to Atlantic Records. So the track begins with this kind of mechanical sounding hum that slowly builds up into this raucous, distorted guitar and aggressive drumming. About 50 seconds or so in, his lyrics just fly out of the speakers, and he says, this is the new year and I don't feel any different. It's eye-opening, and it goes on to describe things that you typically experience at a New Year's party, using his incredible ability to write great metaphors. So he talks about the clanking of crystal and explosions off in the distance. And, to me, this is a song about life going on and not much changing, but people pretending it is for occasions like New Year's Eve. The desire to break free from all that convention. And again, it's another great lead-in, I think, to a powerful album that's amongst my favorites. This album was mind-changing for me when it came out. Ben Gibbard's songwriting is among some of the best, I think, in modern songwriting today. So I know Krista and I have talked about Death Cab and the Postal Service many times in the past.
Yeah, this was on my I made a more extensive list,
So did I.
of course, and this was on there, and it was a contender for the final list for a little while, because it was a time in my life where, you know, I was kind of just discovering a lot of indie stuff, and Death Cab was one of them, and it was one of the big ones. And this album is amazing, and the lead off track is just a great way to kind of start that exploration down, you know, all of the wonderful tracks that are on here. So yeah, it almost made my list, and I love this album. It's whenever I want to get people into Death Cab, I'm like, start with this one. This one is a really, really great one to start with. But yeah, I love this album, and that's a great track to start an album off with.
Steve, any thoughts on Death Cab?
I have to ashamedly admit I'm not very familiar with the band. They've been around 20 years. It sounds like it should be now old enough to now get into my my vision that I can start to seek them out. I do know of them, but I'm not familiar with this. So great pick nonetheless.
Thank you. Fair enough.
I like that you're very open about that. I'm not usually an early adopter either. So, and I'm fine with that too. So, but I like that you're just like, that's the way I am. And don't judge me for it. I like that.
I mean, you have two choices, right?
Yeah.
Say it or don't say it. So that's the truth. So.
All right. Well, I'll close it up here with my track number 4. And Krista, I have to say that your question that you asked me on the first episode of Mixtape Challenge is going to be answered here today. When are you going to bring the Smiths or Morrissey into one of your mixes? And today's the day. So nice. The track that I chose for my track 4, the track 1 of the album The Queen is Dead, the track by the same name, The Queen is Dead, subtitled Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty. So, you know, the Smiths are just is an incredible 80s pop band. I cannot say enough good things about them, and Morrissey solo afterwards. So the Pitchfork ranked this album as the 6th best album of the 1980s. In 2006, NME named it the 2nd best British album of all time, and there's many other publications have given this album similar praise, and I have to go along with all of that. The album itself is just phenomenal, but this track, as an opener, it starts their 3rd album with a snip of a song from 1916 called Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty, which is about homesick soldiers in World War I wanting to go back home to Britain, before this absolutely killer drum beat kicks in as the song starts to fade out into this kind of chaotic crash of guitar and drums. And Morrissey comes in at about the 42-second mark with these biting lyrics about his views on British society and the royal family at the time. It's a really aggressive and powerful pop song that just kind of reaches out and slaps you awake and makes you pay attention to it. And Morrissey talks about being shocked and ashamed to discover that he's a distant descendant of some old queen or other, throws out digs at the Queen and Prince Charles before breaking into the palace with a sponge and a rusty spanner, only to be insulted by the Queen herself, who tells him he can't sing. So it's kind of typical Morrissey there a little bit. But a lot of social commentary in this song, and it ends with the trademark melancholy Morrissey lyrics, life is very long when you're lonely. So don't think that just because this song is very politically charged that you're not going to get the typical melancholy of a Morrissey track. So I think this song is a great way to start this album that just keeps the high quality tracks coming. I don't think there's one song that's skippable on this record. I think it's 80s pop at its absolute finest. So thanks for throwing out the Smiths to me on our first episode there, Krista. I knew I had to include them on this one.
Oh yeah, definitely. I was wondering when you were going to break it out. I figured it would just, when it made sense. I love the Smiths. I love Morrissey. I love the biting commentary on this. It just sort of sets in a very interesting tone for the beginning of the album. I like his bravado a lot of times with, even though, he's got this kind of like sort of, I think within the last decade or so, kind of like this emo, like kind of like sad boy kind of fandom
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of evolved, I think, particularly in Hispanic and Latin American countries. But he is very biting in what he says a lot of times. It's not just this like sad sack, oh, woe is me. I mean, that comes out in there in a lot of stuff that he does. But this one is definitely an example of that, like no holding back kind of biting commentary that you see in some of his music. And this is a great album. I have this album. It has a lot of great stuff on there. I particularly really love this opener, and I think it's a great introduction to the Smiths and Morrissey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. His recent work, as you were mentioning, is become a lot more political than the sad sack kind of songs that we usually associate with Morrissey. But his last couple records have actually been really, really, really good, and I'm sure that some of the tracks from them will wind up on some of my future mixtapes. Steve, any thoughts on the Smiths?
So fortunately, I can say I also love the Smiths and Morrissey and his voice and his lyrics and everything. When I approach music, there's so much out there. I tend to gravitate to the greatest hits as a starting point for bands I don't know. And unfortunately, that means I miss the experience like you shared with, this opening track for the album. But I did go back after discovering them to get the complete 8-disc set. But I'm going to have to go back to The Queen is Dead and just explore that album solely to get this experience, because you approach a large quantity of music sometimes and just try to take in as much as you can, but you might miss the true experience that you laid out there. So I'm going to have to do that. But great pick.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing what you think about it. One of the really interesting parts about this opener for me is, it's a very aggressive song, and the song that follows it on the album is more of a lighthearted and almost funny track. So it's a complete mood shift from the opening track to the track that follows it. So I kind of like that it has that kind of an impact to wake you up and get you in the mood to listen, and then they kind of ramp it down a little bit after that, and the album kind of goes up and down mood wise. It's pretty cool. So all right, that wraps up all of our mixes. Why don't we go back and quickly run down our tracks 1 through 4 for the audience out there. So Steve, why don't you kick us off? Read us your mix again.
Sure. So track 1 was Sounds of Silence by Simon & Garfunkel from the album Sound of Silence. Track 2 was Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night from the album Strangers in the Night. Track 3 was Sam and Dave's Soul Man from the album Soul Men. And finally, the last track was Sookie Sookie by Steppenwolf from the album Steppenwolf.
Nice. Krista?
Track 1 was Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana off of Nevermind, which came out in 1991. Track 2 was Gloria by Patti Smith off of the 1975 album Horses. Track 3 was Crucify by Tori Amos off of the 1992 album Little Earthquakes. And track 4 was The Long Way Around by the Dixie Chicks off of the 2006 album Taking the Long Way.
Okay, and my mix was called The Lead-In. Track 1 was Plain Song by The Cure from the 1989 album Disintegration. Track number 2 is Yours Is No Disgrace, the live version from House of Yes, live from the House of Blues in the year 2000. The track 3 is The New Year by Death Cab for Cutie off of the 2003 album Transatlanticism. And finally, track 4 is The Queen is Dead off of the album The Queen is Dead from 1986 by The Smiths. All right. So guys, what a fun conversation we've had. This has been a really fun mixtape challenge. Thank you both for doing all of your incredible research, and I know we all had trouble boiling down these lists into 4 tracks, so thank you for sharing your mixes with me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's always fun for me to have these kind of projects to kind of delve into and do some research and put something together, and it's a lot of fun for me. Thanks for giving me the challenge.
Of course, and thanks for taking the challenge. So before we close up the show, why don't we give the audience out there a little bit of a rundown of our social media, where they can find us. So Steve Sikoryak, if people want to talk music with you or time travel and paradoxes, where can they find you?
So you can visit paradoxparkway.com, and you can also contact me, Steve, at paradoxparkway.com.
Very cool. Krista, where can people find you?
If you want to, see some of my playlists, because I do make them available for the public, or just chat about music, I am on Apple Music and Twitter at Coriander817. And I also have lists on Spotify, and that is at Krista817.
Very cool. If you want to know more about the show or contact the show, you can find us at mixtapechallenge.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Apple Music, or Spotify with the same handle, 4-Song Mixtape. So thank you out there, everybody, for listening to Mixtape Challenge. And if you would like to submit your own mixes for this challenge or any of our challenges, you can do so through our website or through Twitter by contacting us. We'd love to hear from you, and your mixes will be put up on our website if you submit them. So that'd be pretty fun. So we'll talk to you guys out there soon, and thanks for listening to the Mixtape Challenge.